That the Constitution had not granted the United States government the power to issue paper currency was recognized and accepted even by government officials themselves until the Civil War. During 1862 and 1863, United States notes, popularly known as greenbacks, in the amount of $450 million, were ordered to be printed by Congress. Without any legitimate power to do so, they printed paper and magically created money. This supply of $450 million of instant money helped the government to pay its bills. But for the people who received the greenbacks, they were no bargain. The purchasing power of greenbacks fluctuated, generally downward. During the summer of 1864, goods that could be purchased for a $20 gold piece cost $50 in greenbacks. The issuance of gold certificates and later silver certificates was the next act of monetary sleight of hand by those in government. The premise and argument offered was quite simple. The government has the power to coin money, to mint silver and gold into coins that may be put into circulation, granted in Article 1, Section 8. Since coins are heavy and burdensome, the people will find it more convenient, and it will be less expensive if the government issues paper substitutes. Of course, the amount of paper substitutes issued by the government would not exceed the amount of coins that could be minted from the gold and silver actually held by the government. This change in concept, although clearly a perversion of the monetary powers granted to government, left the government with still only very restricted powers to create money. The next important step of monetary manipulation occurred in 1913. President Woodrow Wilson, on December 23, 1913, signed the Federal Reserve Act. This initiated the creation of the Federal Reserve System, which was to provide a panacea long sought by politicians and economists, a controlled expansion of the money supply. The country was divided into 12 geographic districts, with each district to have one Federal Reserve Bank. The act required that all nationally chartered banks contribute a percentage of their assets to the Reserve Bank in their district. Capital stock in each Federal Reserve Bank was issued to the member banks for their contributions. This was stock in name only, for it could not be sold or transferred and did not entitle the member banks to actually control the Federal Reserve Banks. The government-established reserve banks were to operate within government-established limits that could be changed at any time by the government, and were subject to rules and regulations issued by what is now known as the Board of Governors, 7 political appointees chosen by the President with the consent of the Senate. Each of the 12 Federal Reserve Banks was to be able to issue Federal Reserve notes, which would be claims against the Reserve Bank's assets. The government proclaimed that the notes would be legal tender, which must be accepted as lawful money, and that they would also be an obligation of the United States. The notes themselves could be printed for the reserve banks only by the U.S. Treasury Department, and the number to be printed was limited to an amount not to exceed certain assets the reserve banks would deposit as acceptable collateral. The reserve banks dealt primarily with member banks, and could actually increase the volume of money in circulation by investing in certain commercial credit transactions defined as notes, drafts, and bills of exchange issued or drawn for agricultural, industrial, or commercial purposes that matured within 90 days. Investing in these short-term goods-producing transactions was to result in an increase in the amount of goods available, and also increase the amount of money in circulation and new credit available to balance the situation. How beneficial or harmful this limited amount of monetary manipulation could have been is debatable, but not really important, for changes began taking place almost at once. The Federal Reserve Banks opened for business in 1914, and 2 years later, September 7, 1916, a significant new means of monetary manipulation was granted by the government to this government-created agency. The reserve banks could now loan money directly to member banks on the basis of their promissory notes secured by certain commercial credit, which included bonds or notes of the United States. To whom this new power was important became apparent almost immediately. World War I was already sweeping across Europe, and soon American fighting men were involved. When America entered the war, government spending took a gigantic jump upward. Other than coining money, The government has only two legitimate ways of obtaining money to pay its bills. One, taxes, and two, borrowing against the credit of the United States. Higher taxes are never popular with the citizens, so politicians have usually found borrowing, spend now, pay later, to be far more politically expedient. The government debt, which had been $1.2 billion on June 30th, 1916, ballooned to $25.5 billion in just 3 years. The government had borrowed over $24 billion from somewhere during this 3-year period. How they were able to do so is quite simple. Banks across the nation bought huge amounts of government bonds, for that was the patriotic thing to do. Government securities went to the bank, and the bank's money went to the government. The bank could replace its money by borrowing money from the Federal Reserve Bank on the basis of its promissory note secured by the government bonds. The Federal Reserve Bank could replace its money by ordering new Federal Reserve notes from the government, with the government bond secured promissory note of the local bank deposited as collateral. The government now actually had newly created money, which it put into circulation by paying its bills. The government could now spend more money because the increased supply of money generated an even greater amount of available credit, and the people could now be sold even more government bonds. This procedure had just one restraining factor. New money could be created only temporarily, for only short-term government securities could be used as security for the bank promissory notes that were used by the reserve banks as collateral for new Federal Reserve notes. Shortly after the war, America entered the era of the Roaring Twenties. People were enjoying the good life materially, business was booming, and even government was prospering as revenues from taxes exceeded spending year after year. The national debt, which had been $25.5 billion in 1919, was being paid off, and by 1930 had been reduced to just over $16 billion. The crash came in October 1929. And an economic depression almost paralyzed the nation. For most Americans, it was a bleak time. They tightened their belts and tried to provide for their loved ones as best they could. Government income from taxes decreased, but the politicians increased rather than reduced government spending and fell back on borrowing the money to pay the bills. But the overspending was somewhat handicapped, for the people lacked the money and credit to purchase very many government bonds and notes. On February 27, 1932, the Glass-Steagall Act became law and declared that any government security or obligation purchased by the Federal Reserve banks would be acceptable to the government as collateral for new Federal Reserve notes to be printed for the reserve banks. Politicians could now issue and sell an unlimited amount of bonds and notes to obtain the money to pay for their spending programs. Government overspending could now be changed into new money permanently in circulation. And this is what began happening. During the 4 months immediately following passage of the Glass-Steagall Act, enough government security to increase the government debt by $1.3 billion. This had been possible because during that same period, the government-established Federal Reserve banks bought enough government securities to increase their holdings by over $1 billion. Just one small stumbling block remained. Americans could still hold gold for monetary purposes. This limited the issuance of paper money somewhat, for the people could always simply return the Federal Reserve notes to the U.S. Treasury and demand that they be redeemed in gold. During the early days of Roosevelt's first administration, the American people were stripped of the privilege of possessing gold for monetary purposes, and this action successfully removed the last stumbling block. Between June 30th, 1932 and June 30th, 1969, the government-established Federal Reserve banks increased their holdings of government securities by more than $52.3 billion. These new assets served as the collateral for the additional $44.3 billion in Federal Reserve notes the government printed for the Federal Reserve banks.